The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining and welcome to today's webinar on using data intelligence for data migration. My name is Vesh and I'm part of the sales and marketing team at Sandhill. Today we'll be exploring how leveraging data intelligence can streamline and enhance your data migration efforts, ensuring a smooth transition that meets both technical and business requirements. So throughout the webinar, if you would like to ask any questions, please use the chat on the side panel, and we will address each question at the end of the webinar, at the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. Just to let you all know as well, this webinar is being recorded, and you will each receive a link to the recording after the session is over. One of our consultants. I will now have our senior consultant at Sandhill, and he will be guiding you through today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavesh, and a warm welcome to everybody. And as the sort of opening introductory slide is talking here, my name is Jog Raj. I'm one of the solution architects here at Sandhill, and I'll be leading you through this webinar for today's session. And as the notes here say, we're going to be really using data intelligence for data migration, and that's the idea of looking at how we can be intelligent in applying any practical techniques and things to performing any data migration projects that we might be interested in. And there is a brief agenda. There's a few things that I want to cover. So we'll be doing a bit of a brief introduction and overview, looking at some data migration strategy, best practices and key steps that we found from practical experience will be of great benefit to you, and how you can use data intelligence generally, and more specifically the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite, to handle your data migration or any other data migration that you might be interested in. And we are also going to be taking a very brief look at the importance of data quality in the process of data migration, as well as the importance of testing that testing that plays within the migration process as well. And at the end, as we're saying, we've got some Q&A session if people have got any questions. But please feel free to raise any questions in the chat, and my colleagues will do their best to answer those. Else, if we don't get the opportunity to do that, we'll pick them up towards the end, or we'll follow up with an email. So what are we actually talking about when we're talking about data migration? And as this one slide talks about, many organizations really rely on that data more than ever before. And they rely on it from the IT and the business operations through to their strategic decision making, as well as sales and marketing pipelines. There's really nothing that IT doesn't touch. But obviously, there's a continuous evolving need as the market and the business requirements and the client requirements evolve for the technologies that are involved, for them also to evolve and take advantage of any new developments that there are. And data migration is often a critical process that is part of this continuous evolution. And so by data migration in its broadest sense, it really involves transferring data from one location, format, or application to another. And the hope and expectation is that the migration brings new benefits, including things like improved performance, increased competitiveness, scalability, cost savings, and maximizing the value. So there's much to be gained from doing data migrations, especially with this sort of cloud migrations that people often get engaged with. But why do enterprises want to do data migration? Why is it important? Well, there's many reasons for this, and each of these can significantly impact the efficiency, the performance, and competitiveness of an organization. And some of these key drivers include the business agility. The hope is that access to up-to-date data in an efficient system allows organizations to adapt quickly and stay competitive. There's the hope that there will be improved performance, with newer systems typically faster, more efficient, better organized, and they offer greater potential for significant performance improvements in accessing the data and being able to work with different types of data and faster, quicker, easier. And of course, in all of this, there's always cost efficiencies as a contributing factor that need to be considered. And often migrating to more modern cloud-based solutions can reduce your operational costs through lower maintenance requirements, optimized resource usage, and better availability of skilled personnel, especially in some of the new technologies that are available. And of course, as technology evolves, older systems become obsolete or inefficient, difficult to maintain. They might have achieved or got to the end of their life, and so maintenance becomes significantly challenging. And so migrating the existing data or migrating applications and business processes, whilst it can be a problematic and daunting task, you really have to embark upon it with a proper approach and planning so that the data migration itself is a complete success. And so what we're going to do in this session is we're going to cover some of the practical steps that can be taken to support this particular process. And, when we're talking about the main types of migration, obviously there's very popular talk and a lot of noise in the industry about cloud migration. And obviously that involves moving your data, your applications, or other business elements into a cloud environment. And this could involve moving from an on-premises data center to the cloud, or from one cloud environment to another, or a hybrid combination of the two. And obviously, you've also got database migration. Now, this encompasses the migration of database platforms, data warehouses, data lakes, things like the Microsoft Active Directory, as an example of some data that you might want to move. And the migration of databases can often involve adjusting the data without changing the structure. There is often always the case, or there is often a case also that the structure itself might change as well. But of course, there's also storage migration and replication. Now, this deals with transferring or replicating data from one storage device to another, or to a hard disk, or to the cloud. Now, obviously, there's more sophisticated and complicated data migration, which isn't purely data migration, but it's more of an application migration, which entails moving an application and its associated data from one environment to another. Again, this could be from an on-premises server to a cloud environment, or it could be from an on-premises application to a cloud-based application in its full right. And of course, all these applications, they might involve the actual business processes as well. And so there is often a need to involve or include and migrate your business processes as well. And moving these business processes and applications will invariably involve having to migrate and move the data to their new environment. And again, if you're moving your business processes, that also gives the opportunity there, should you wish to want to take it, to re-engineer those processes. So overall, in any of these, it could be a simple, straightforward database replication and duplication, or it might involve a little bit more sophisticated changes that need to be made as we're migrating from one environment into another. Now, obviously, in any change, whether it be database migration or data migration or any other change, there's always the concerns that the business, that the enterprise has. And it can often be not plain sailing, unless, of course, we do some proper planning and prepare for the data migration. And so in this particular webinar, what we're going to do is explore some of the most common challenges that organizations face during the data migration process, and make practical suggestions and practical tips on how to address those. Yeah. And one of those is going to be concerns regarding data compatibility. So, for example, from the source to the target systems, they may involve different data formats, they may involve different structures or even schemas, you know. And handling that requires that the data itself be transformed and mapped to make sure that there is compatibility in what we're migrating from one source to the target environment. During that process of migration, we want to ensure that the data integrity and accuracy is fully maintained. There's nothing worse than having migrated your data and finding it's broken or the quality is decreased and it becomes unusable. So ensuring that data is not lost, corrupted, or altered in unexpected ways during the migration is absolutely critical. And of course, we need verification mechanisms to be in place to confirm that the migrated data matches the source data exactly as we would have expected. And of course, also, you know, if we're migrating, there is that window where the existing systems may be running down, or they might not be operational. And that means there's downtime involved, which can disrupt the business operations. So minimizing the downtime is often a key concern. And obviously, during that period when there is downtime, if there's any other sources of data which may have been involved in the data migration, they're accumulating, and we have to be able to handle that incremental delta data itself as well. And of course, there's always the concern of poor data quality. We don't want to lose any data, we don't want to corrupt it, we don't want to degrade it. And if possible, we would like to take this opportunity to try to improve the quality if at all possible. And of course, you know, we've got to minimize all of this on the business operations, keep them down to a minimum. Otherwise, you know, the stakeholders can get involved and be upset that they're suffering inadversible impacts on the operation and performance of their enterprise. And of course, you know, there are always cost implications and return on investment. You know, data migration projects can be expensive, and the business needs to ensure that the migration provides a clear benefit, either by way of improved efficiencies, scalability, cost savings. There's always the need to justify the cost expenditure out there. And of course, throughout all of this, we need to be able to manage the stakeholder expectations and be able to communicate to them effectively. And so whilst data migration can be complex and challenging, you know, again, if we follow some best practices and key steps, we can help to ensure that the entire process is as smooth and a successful process as can be. Now, if we're looking at the sort of key data migration practices and key steps in there, now, this particular webinar isn't intended to be a complete treatise or a treatment of all the steps in detail, but some of the high-level steps involve what we're showing here on the slides. And it goes, you know, really without saying that you should really plan thoroughly and start with a detailed plan that outlines the scope, the objectives, the timeline, and resources required for the migration. And in this webinar, we're going to look at each of these steps which are shown here. So the first thing is, well, you know, what's the intent? What's the business or the enterprise's goals and objectives? There's got to be a clear purpose that we need to understand what we want to try to achieve. Because if we don't understand what we're trying to achieve, how do we know when we've got there and achieved what we wanted to set out? So that's very, very fundamental. And of course, whilst there might be specific guidelines and principles to follow as part of the data migration, generally there should be an expectation or requirement that there is some sort of data strategy and policy in place which provides the guidelines and principles for how you're going to handle data in general, and also specifically how you're going to handle it as we're going through the migration process. Again, I say this is a big topic and it's not the main thrust of what we're wanting to do, but data governance is certainly something which is very important and a great consideration for for people to consider when migrating the data. Now, if we look at migration and how can we use tool sets to help us to make that process easier and better and faster, well, powering your data migration, well, Irwin by Quest have a portfolio of products. And as part of those, there is the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite, and that's currently at version 14. That was released sometime last week. And we're going to be looking at that and how that can help us to support the process of data migration. And the idea behind that is that the Data Intelligence Suite gives us the ability to be able to understand the context of our data and the metadata that we've got, the classes, the quality, the lineage, the ownership, how the data gets transformed, and its relationships and business context. It provides quite a lot of background information as well as the detailed information about the data itself, or rather the metadata, and gives you the opportunity to be able to understand it. Because that's key. We've got to be able to understand what the data is and the metadata in order for us to be able to migrate it. And of course, the Irwin data modeling capability also comes into play in here. And that also is at version 14, and that's going to be released sometime this week. So you can pick up the latest versions of that as well to help you in your data migration journey. As part of today's webinar, we're also going to be taking a look at the Irwin data quality capabilities. And there's a new release, which is at version 2. That's part of the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite, but that's the Irwin data quality. And that aspect of the data migration, the data quality itself, is a very key, important part that plays an important part as part of the data migration process. And we're going to take a look at that. So if we start thinking about the way or the aspects that we need to understand about our data, then these sets of tools can help us in there. Now, obviously, there's going to be out there in the marketplace specific platform-specific products which might help you to do specific data migration and data replication and data distribution. There might be products out there, and they will, to a degree, automate the migration and the data replication. But often, as I say, to be able to understand that data is not provided necessarily by those applications. You have to have a deep understanding, meaning, and understand the metadata very well in great depth in order to understand what it is and the value of it and what we're actually migrating to. And that's where these particular tools come into play. So if we start thinking about some of the functionality and capabilities that we need to start looking at, some of the first things that we need to do is to actually understand and discover our metadata. And so there's a number of ways that we can do this. And the examples that I'm showing you here, we can use the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite, and they support a number of different sources of your metadata. So, for example, you've got your Oracle and your SQL Server and Snowflake schemas that you can understand. So we need to discover that. Obviously, we can do that using the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite, but we can also use the Irwin Data Modeler, and they provide complementary metadata information to one another. And we'll take a look at that in just a moment. And of course, if we're looking at the metadata, one of the other key things that we want to do, as well as being able to understand the data structures, is to actually understand and catalog the source data or source metadata that we've got and catalog that. And of course, we can also create a target metadata and understand what the target metadata is going to be as well. And we need to have an understanding of the mappings between the source and the target as well. Because in that mapping, that has to be very explicit to say this particular column, this particular field, it may have a particular metadata characteristic, the type, the length, the precision, the type, etc. And we need to be able to map those to what the target is. And again, in the absence of understanding what your source and target metadata is, it becomes an impossible exercise to do this. But again, as I was saying, there are tools out there which can help to automate that process. But also here, if those tools don't do the target metadata and the target applications and the target databases you're interested in, we're going to have to use very specific, or we're going to have to use not so specific tool sets like the ones that we're looking at, because these are sort of generic types of tool sets that we can use for the data migration. Another key important part of this is that not only do we want to understand the mappings, but we also might, or invariably will need to understand in any of that data, is there any transformation that's taking place? Is there any of the metadata that we need to transform from one format to another? It might be by virtue of the different types, or it might be the fact that we need to expand it or have it in a different format. It's been converted from a text field into a date field or a currency field or something like that. And we need to understand what the rules are around that. There's also the ability to be able to take, as part of that mapping, an understanding and saying, okay, if we're taking the data from our source, are there any reference data sets that we should be using? So, for example, there might be country codes, or gender codes. So one particular data might be in the source, might be known as, say, for example, if we're looking at our gender fields, it might be specified in there as being male, but in the target one, it may be known as just simply M or a different value. And having a predefined list of those lookups and reference code sets is of great value, so that we can show consistency and quality in the data as it's being transformed from one source to the target in there. And of course, if you think about the large numbers of tables and fields that might be involved, those exercises can be very, very costly in terms of the time required. But we can accelerate this using artificial intelligence to help us to automate the mappings and have some of those mappings predefined in lookup tables that we can use. And a final point in this also is that, again, it depends if you want to do a sort of blind migration, which says, I don't care what the data is, just move it from one place to another. Or if you want to be a little bit more intelligent. If you want to be a little bit more intelligent and only take the data through in the migration that is of value and of necessity, then we might also want to look at where did the source data itself come from, and understand what that actual data is, rather than it just being a particular table and a particular field of data somewhere. Where did that come from, and what's the meaning and the value of that particular data? And for that purpose, it is often important to use lineage to help us to understand where that particular data itself has come from. So how do we start on this? Well, as I was saying, we can start using the tool sets to help us catalog the metadata in there, help them to use and create the mappings between those. And then obviously we need to be able to create or rather we can also use the OWIN data modeler to help us to create the data models that we've got. And they give us the option to be able to go in and understand the conceptual, the logical and physical data points, understand the current and the to-be, understand the critical data, understand examine the relationships and the dependencies. And that gives us the ability to be able to look at the metadata and say, what data is actually important to us? What is critical to us? What's within scope and what's out of scope? Do we want all this historical information? Do we want this transactional information that's in there? And are there any temporal data sets that are in there that we can discard? So having the sort of data models gives you the ability to be able to do that. And of course, as part of the migration process, as I was saying, if we're looking at creating, say, lookup tables and reference tables, we might create those and have code sets which predefine for us to say, this is what we're expecting in the source, this is what it's going to go to in the target, and create a mapping up front so that we define what the code sets are and the mappings are between the source and the target in there. And again, we can use the tool sets to define that. If we've used the tool sets to define the source and the targets, we can use them to help us identify any issues that might arise. So, for example, they can be used to automatically identify for us differences between the data types or the data lengths, and identify those so that we can upfront before the migration know exactly how we're going to handle any changes. You know, what transformation rules do we need to build in to make sure that the data is migrated correctly from one place to another. So here's an example of using the Irwin Data Modeler to help us to identify the differences between the source and the target. Here's an example of using the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite to do something similar. And again, it's helping us to identify in here differences between the source and the target. In this example, I happen to be taking an Oracle database to a SQL database, and it's identified the fact that there are differences in the data types and the data lengths, and we can identify those and again, you know, prepare ourselves for that. So assessing the metadata compatibility and transformation, we can do that up front, you know, so we can handle any aberrant mappings in their data type mismatches, truncations. And as part of that migration, we can define upfront the business and transformation rules, the reference data and lookups, yeah, code sets and code mappings. So this is, you know, very explicitly saying here in our source, we've got a particular length. It's going to a particular target column length of 5. You know, is that an issue? Or are we going to write up some business rule which is going to handle that? And that business rule or that transformation rule then becomes the coding that we can use to define our ETL transactions, yeah, so that when actually migrating the data, that's the coding that we're going to use. Yeah. So it's all about preparation and planning up front. And if we know what we've got, we know what we're going to get to, we can use that both up front and after the migration to make sure that the migration itself was a success, because we can go along and run tests based on the planning that we've made in there. Another thing, again, you know, as a way of being able to handle the metadata is, can we look at any unmapped data? You know, is there any source data that we are not moving over, and are we aware of it? And again, we can use tool sets to help us handle that. So here's an example of using the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite to do that. And of course, what we can also do is to use data lineage. As I was saying, the data lineage gives us the ability to perform sort of any impact analyses for any modernization and migration efforts. Yeah? And we can use that to look at the key data pipelines and to pinpoint any data quality issues and understand where the data is originating from. And so we can understand where it's being sourced from. So rather than just, you know, dealing with the source and the target, we're actually dealing with the origins of the data and the transformations, the migrations as the data moved to the end sourcing point for our migration efforts. Yeah. So again, you know, we can use lineage folders. And this is part of the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite, and we can do the data lineage in there. And that can also be automated, you know, using artificial intelligence to help us to understand these mappings, or we can use what are called smart connectors to be able to reverse engineer ETL code or SQL triggers to help us to understand what these mappings are. Now, as I was saying, so far we've been talking about understanding the schemas and the structures and the mappings in there. But, you know, the data migration process also gives us the opportunity to be able to go along and perform data quality and assess what the quality of the data itself is and what we can do to improve that. It's an opportunity to help us to improve that. It's also an opportunity to help us to identify any sensitive data and handle that accordingly, because again, as part of the migration process, we don't want to lose that data, and we need to handle it sensitively within there. And so we can use data quality to start analyzing the source data, understand its structure, the content, identify patterns, distributions of the data, the frequency of the data elements, and we can use those to help us to compare that, with the defined metadata that we've got, and identify any issues where we've got missing data, duplicate data, errors, inconsistencies, etc. And we should really be doing that or running data quality tests both pre-migration and post-migration to make sure that the quality of the data has not degraded during that migration process in there. And so, again, if we're looking at the OV Data Intelligence Suite, if we've got the source and the target metadata defined, we can run data quality tests, which give us an assessment of the quality of particular fields in there, or it might be the quality assessment of the overall table. So we're actually looking at the data defined on the metadata and looking at quality profile reports to help us to understand what that data itself is. Yeah. And that could, as I was saying, be the table level, the field level. It can also help us to identify, are there any particular fields in there which are sensitive data, and we need to handle those accordingly within there. And if we're doing, let's say, an incremental data migration, we can start looking at historical data and see if we are moving the data over time, if there's any degradation in that data over time, if you're doing it in a sort of stepwise incremental migration rather than a sort of big bang type of approach. So there's many ways of building up these reports and understanding the health and the quality of the actual data up front before we do the migration, and use those same quality assessments after the migration to make sure that we maintain, we at least maintain the quality, if not improve it, after the migration itself. So when it comes to the actual migration itself, that's really beyond the scope of our webinar today. What we are interested in doing is saying it doesn't matter whether it is a big bang approach or an incremental approach or data prioritization or any other, or whether indeed it is just a migration or a partitioning or use case, or a cascading of your data that you're doing. Understanding what your metadata is and understanding the source and the target will give you great benefit in managing that migration process with the use of the tools that we've got. So what we're talking about here in the overall migration process is what I like to call a sort of a shift left testing policy. Define your tests, understand what your tests are as early as you can in the life cycle of your migration. Yeah. Do pre-migration understanding of your metadata, test the metadata structurally from its schema, and doing comparisons of the structure and the format and the type up front, again, so that we know what changes we are likely to expect, and make sure that we understand those both pre-migration and post-migration in there. We should run data quality assessments and remediation up front, perform your pilot if necessary, and do your migration. Pilots are recommended, or pilot migrations are recommended, so you can do a sort of test and in a controlled environment before you actually go live, as it were. Then obviously we should do a post-migration data quality assessment and verification that the structures are correct and the quality of the assets that have been migrated are good. And so with that in mind, as I was saying, we can use the Data Intelligence Suite, but there's also another product which I'm not going to cover in great detail here, but it's worthy of being mentioned, and that's SharePlex. So that's another product which has been designed specifically for not just database migration, but also for replication and distribution of your data, but very specifically targeted at specific target databases. there is more of that to come a little bit in one of the later slides that I've got in here. So overall, in the example that we're talking about here, plan up front using the Data Intelligence Suite to help us understand the current usage and the structure and the format. We can use Data Modeler to help us to do that as well. Use data quality to help us improve the quality of the data that we've got, remove data duplication, any quality issues, identify any sensitive information in there. Use that to help us to migrate the content. And of course, for migrating it, we're going to use external tools, ETL tools, database backups, and log history files and so forth to actually go and do that migration. And then post-migration, again, we can use the Data Intelligence Suite to help us to validate that the migration has been successful by looking at the metadata structures, running data quality tests again, and using the Shareplex, if you're using that, to test and check that the migration itself has been a success. So I've tried to limit this webinar, to about 40 minutes, so that it's not too long a session. I know I've gone through this quite quickly, but there's quite a lot to sort of think about in terms of how we can help as part of any database migration exercises. And I'm sure that there are these tool sets which are available, and possibly others which are available to help you in that migration. And Erwin and Quest have had experience, and they've got case studies with existing clients which they can share with you to help you get a bit more of an understanding and appreciation of what is possible and how others have done this in there. But the hope is, that it's appreciated that migrating your data is a complex process, but using these appropriate tools can make the whole process automated, faster, easier, and of higher quality. So with that in mind, I don't know if my colleagues have managed to answer all the questions, or if they've got any questions that have popped up in the chat. Steve, Pabesh, are there any urgent questions in there which people have raised that are worthy of?
Yeah, there's one here about how is ONDQ and data lineage different to Azure Purview?
So Azure Purview itself is very specific to what Azure itself can handle. It's got some limited functionality within there. And Azure Purview will only manage the databases that it's looking at. What we can do as part of the OWIN Data Intelligence Suite is, there was a slide in there right at the beginning which I was showing you, which talked about the different, the different data sources that you had. Let me just find that for you. So when you're bringing in your metadata, you're not just limited to the Azure databases that you've got. In your environment, there might be other databases. So, for example, it could be an SAP or a Snowflake or other environments. And being able to understand those in your broader picture is of great is of great value. So you're not just restricted to those databases which are supported in Azure. And the same applies in terms of the lineage. If you look at the source where the data itself originates from, it won't be just one exclusive Azure database. It could be many, many different types of sources which might contribute and congregate and accumulate in an Azure database, as part of its journey. But the source and the origins may be of many different ones. So this gives you the ability to be able to understand your lineage and your metadata in a broader context rather than just specific to Azure. Hope that answers the question. Any other burning questions there, Steve? No?
Well, there was a previous one about the mapping, auto mapping.
Yes.
How is AI used in the auto mappings?
Yeah, so that's a good question there, because as I was saying before, you know, to actually do the metadata mappings can be a very laborious exercise. And so what the Irwin Data Intelligence Suite does, it looks at your metadata, but what it does is it looks at the metadata, but not just the field names. It looks at any other sources that might be there, which are catalogued. So it might look at the logical names of fields. It might look at the physical names. It might look at the actual names of the column fields. And it may even look at other metadata, say, for example, from business terms, to help it understand what that piece of data could possibly be. And the idea then is to say, okay, if I think that there's this keyword, you know, like a date, for example, or a transaction code or something, and it appears in multiple contexts, that there's a good chance it might match something else somewhere else. Yeah. So, you know, if you've got a code or a transaction code and it appears many times in one place, it could infer that there's a mapping to something called transaction code, which appears as a logical name, or TID, which appears as a physical name. So it's not just looking at the column names, it's trying to pick up information from the names of the logical fields, the physical fields, and any other contextual information, descriptions, for example, to help you to identify potential candidates for that. And there's a sort of sliding scale of confidence, you know, and the more specific in that sliding scale you want, the greater the degree of confidence it will have in proposing potential matches for you. And obviously, if you reduce that confidence down to, you know, lower levels, there's obviously more erroneous data that could be included. But at the end of the day, the AI is there to accelerate that mapping for you. But human intervention is still required to confirm whether that mapping is correct or not. But certainly the AI is there to help you accelerate it. Okay, any final questions? Okay, and in that case, let me just wrap up and finish off by saying, I've mentioned SharePlex. If you do want to follow up and find out a little bit more about that, then we are holding another session, and it's planned for September the 24th. And here's some brief details about that. And if you're interested, please do sign up, and we'll cover that in a bit more detail than what I have covered here today. And for anything that you've seen here today, there is some contact information for you. If you want to know more, if you've got any more questions that you want to ask, or if you want to look at anything that I've presented here in a bit more detail, then please do make contact with us, and we'll do our best to help you. And Bhupesh will follow up with a thank you email and the details of where you can download the presentation that you've seen today, as well as the recording. And with that in mind, thank you very much for your time for attending, and we hope to see you again at some time in the future. Thank you, and bye.